Welcome, everyone. Get comfortable, settle into your favorite spot, maybe grab a blanket and a pillow, and let me tell you the story of a man who started as the most selfish person on the planet and became the hero who would eventually save the entire universe. The story of Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man, and this is a story about redemption and genius and learning that life is about more than just yourself. About how one man's journey from caring only about money and fame and his own ego to caring about everyone else and being willing to sacrifice everything shaped not just his own life, but the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe and everyone in it. So let's start at the very beginning, with a boy born into privilege who would spend most of his life trying to earn his father's approval and never quite succeeding until it was far too late. Anthony Edward Stark was born in 1970 to Howard Stark and Maria Stark, entering a world of wealth and opportunity that most people could never imagine. Because Howard Stark wasn't just rich, he was one of the most brilliant inventors and engineers of his generation. A man who had helped win World War II by creating advanced weapons and technology for the Allied forces, who had worked with people like Captain America and the Super Soldier program, who had founded Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, better known as SHIELD, and who had basically shaped the modern world through his innovations in technology and defense. But being a genius inventor and being a good father were two very different things, and Howard Stark was brilliant at the former and absolutely terrible at the latter. Young Tony grew up in the Stark mansion, surrounded by wealth and technology and opportunity, with access to the best schools and the best teachers and basically everything money could buy. But what he couldn't buy, and what he desperately wanted, was his father's attention, his father's approval, his father's love. Because Howard was always working, always in the lab or in meetings or traveling for business. And when he was around Tony, he was distant and critical and impossible to please, no matter what Tony accomplished. No matter how brilliant Tony's inventions were, Howard would just nod and say it was good but could be better, or point out the flaws, or compare it to something he had done at Tony's age. And this created in Tony a deep wound that would never fully heal. A desperate need to prove himself, to be recognized, to be seen as worthy, combined with a defense mechanism of pretending he didn't care, of acting like his father's opinion meant nothing to him, of projecting supreme confidence and arrogance to hide the insecurity and pain underneath. Tony was a certified genius, and I'm not using that term lightly. This was a kid who built his first circuit board at age 4, his first engine at age 6, who was solving complex mathematical equations that most adults couldn't understand before he was in middle school, who hacked into the Pentagon's firewall on a dare when he was 13 just to prove he could do it, and who graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology at age 17 with dual degrees in physics and engineering, breaking records and astounding professors with his intellect and his ability to see connections and solutions that no one else could see. But along with that genius came arrogance and entitlement, and a complete lack of discipline or boundaries. Because Tony had never been told no, had never faced real consequences for his actions, had always been able to charm or buy or invent his way out of any problem. And this made him incredibly difficult to be around. Narcissistic and self-absorbed, and convinced that he was smarter than everyone else, which to be fair, he usually was, but that didn't make him any less insufferable. When Tony was 21 years old, his parents died in what he was told was a car accident, their vehicle running off the road on a quiet stretch of highway on the 16th of December, 1991. And Tony inherited everything: the Stark mansion, the Stark fortune, and most importantly, Stark Industries. This massive weapons manufacturing company that employed thousands of people and made billions of dollars selling advanced military technology to the United States government and allied nations. And Tony was completely unprepared for this responsibility, was still essentially a kid despite his genius. And he dealt with his grief the way he dealt with everything difficult in his life, by not dealing with it at all, by burying himself in work and partying and women and alcohol, becoming the public face of Stark Industries, the playboy billionaire who showed up at weapons demonstrations with a drink in his hand and a model on his arm, who gave flippant interviews and made jokes about serious things, who seemed to care more about his car collection than about the weapons his company was producing or the people those weapons might hurt. Obadiah Stane, Howard's old business partner and friend, became the de facto leader of Stark Industries, running the day-to-day operations, while Tony served as the face of the company and the genius behind the weapons designs. And on the surface, this arrangement worked well. with Stain handling the business side and Tony handling the innovation side. But underneath, Stain resented Tony, saw him as a spoiled child who had inherited what Stain felt he had earned through decades of work alongside Howard. And Stain began making decisions that prioritized profit over ethics, selling weapons to anyone who would pay, regardless of whether they should have access to that technology. But Tony didn't notice or didn't care because he was too busy living his life of excess and refusing to think about the consequences of his actions or the moral implications of making weapons for a living. Tony had exactly one real friend during this period, James Rhodes, who everyone called Rhodey, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force who had met Tony at MIT and somehow managed to see past the arrogance and ego to the person underneath. The brilliant but damaged kid who used humor and sarcasm as armor to protect himself from getting hurt. And Rhodey became the person who tried to keep Tony grounded, who called him on his nonsense, who showed up at Tony's mansion to drag him out of bed when he was too hungover to make important meetings, who genuinely cared about Tony's well-being even when Tony was being completely impossible. And their friendship was one of the few genuine connections Tony had in his life. One of the few relationships not based on money or what Tony could do for someone. Then there was Pepper Potts, who started as Tony's personal assistant, hired to manage his schedule and his life and basically keep him functional. And Pepper was unlike anyone else in Tony's orbit because she wasn't impressed by his wealth or his genius. She saw him as a job that needed managing, and she was incredibly good at that job, anticipating his needs before he knew what they were, cleaning up his messes both literal and metaphorical, keeping his life organized despite his best efforts to create chaos. And she did all of this with a combination of competence and sass that Tony found both frustrating and intriguing. Because here was someone who didn't worship him or fear him, who just treated him like a brilliant but occasionally difficult person who needed help managing basic life tasks. And over time, Tony came to rely on Pepper for everything, trusting her with access to his money and his homes and his secrets, though he was still too emotionally stunted to recognize that what he felt for her was more than just professional appreciation. Everything changed in Afghanistan when Tony traveled there to demonstrate his company's latest creation, the Jericho missile, a devastating weapon system that could eliminate multiple targets with a single launch. And Tony was showing off as always, drinking scotch on the flight over, taking selfies with starstruck soldiers, giving a slick presentation in the desert about how his missile would help bring peace through superior firepower, which was the kind of cognitive dissonance Tony specialized in, convincing himself that making more destructive weapons somehow made the world safer. And after the demonstration, Tony was riding back to the airbase in a military convoy, sitting in a Humvee with some young soldiers who were excited to meet him, asking him to sign things and take photos, treating him like a celebrity. And Tony was loving the attention and probably drunk and definitely not paying attention to the danger they were in, when suddenly the convoy was attacked by terrorists, explosions everywhere, gunfire, chaos, and Tony stumbled out of the Humvee and hid behind some rocks. And that's when he saw something that shattered his entire worldview in a single moment. One of the missiles being fired at them had Stark Industries written on the side. His own weapons, technology he had designed and built and sold, being used to kill American soldiers. And before he could process this betrayal, before he could even begin to understand the implications, another missile landed near him, a Stark Industries missile, and Tony saw his name on the weapon that was about to kill him and had just enough time to think about the irony before it exploded. And shrapnel tore through his chest, piercing his skin and driving fragments of metal toward his heart, and everything went black. Tony woke up in a cave, which was not where he expected to wake up. And his chest hurt and there was a car battery next to him, connected by wires to something embedded in his chest. And standing over him was a man who introduced himself as Ho Yinsen, a doctor and engineer who explained that Tony had been injured badly, that shrapnel from the explosion was lodged near his heart and slowly moving toward it, and that Yinsen had performed surgery and installed an electromagnet powered by a car battery to keep the shrapnel from reaching Tony's heart and killing him. Essentially, Yinsen had saved Tony's life using crude equipment in a cave, and Tony was now a prisoner of a terrorist group called the 10 Rings, who wanted Tony to build them a Jericho missile using the stockpile of Stark weapons they had acquired. And if Tony refused, they would torture him and eventually kill him. So Tony agreed to build them the missile, but he had no intention of actually doing it. He just needed to buy time to figure out a way to escape. Tony and Yinsen worked together in the cave, and as they worked, they talked. And Tony learned that Yinsen was from a small town called Gulmira, that he had been a surgeon and a professor before being kidnapped by the Ten Rings, and that his family was dead, killed in the same kind of violence and chaos that Tony's weapons had helped create. Though Yinsen didn't say this directly, didn't blame Tony, but the implication was there, hanging in the air between them. And Tony also learned that he and Yinsen had actually met before, years ago at a conference in Bern, Switzerland, where Yinsen had approached Tony to discuss his research. But Tony had been drunk and dismissive, had blown Yinsen off without even really looking at him, and Yinsen remembered this encounter even though Tony didn't, which showed just how little Tony had paid attention to anyone but himself in his old life, how many people he had dismissed or ignored because they weren't important to him. The first thing Tony built in that cave was a miniaturized arc reactor, a revolutionary clean energy device based on his father's old designs but smaller and more efficient. And this arc reactor powered the electromagnet in Tony's chest, replacing the car battery and giving Tony mobility. And this was typical Tony Stark, casually inventing technology that could change the world while imprisoned in a cave with limited resources. But he wasn't done, because Tony then proposed to Yinsen that instead of building the terrorists a missile, they build something else, something that would allow them to escape. And Tony designed a suit of armor, the Mark I, crude and clunky and built from spare parts and scrap metal, but equipped with flamethrowers and limited flight capability and enough armor to withstand gunfire. Basically a walking tank that would let them fight their way out of the cave and escape. They worked for weeks or maybe months. Time became difficult to track in the cave, building the suit in secret while pretending to work on the missile. And during this time, Tony and Yinsen talked about everything, about their lives and their regrets and their hopes for the future. And Yinsen asked Tony a question that Tony had never really considered. He asked what Tony would do if he got out of the cave, what he would do with his life if he survived. And Tony didn't have a good answer because he'd never thought about his life in terms of purpose or meaning, had always just lived for the moment, for the next party or the next invention or the next conquest, never considering legacy or making a difference or using his gifts for something beyond his own benefit. When the suit was finally ready, when they'd done everything they could with the limited resources available, Yinsen helped Tony put on the armor and began the boot-up sequence. But the terrorists realized what was happening and attacked, breaking into their work area, and Yinsen grabbed a gun and ran out to hold them off, to buy Tony time for the suit to power up. And Tony was trapped in the armor, waiting for the systems to activate, listening to gunfire and shouting. And when the suit finally came online and Tony could move, he burst out of the cave section where he'd been trapped and found Yinsen on the ground, shot multiple times, dying. And Tony tried to help him, tried to get him to safety so they could escape together. But Yinsen told him to go, told him not to waste his life, told him that this was always the plan because Yinsen's family was dead and he was going to see them soon. And Tony understood that Yinsen had never planned to leave the cave, had helped Tony escape knowing it would cost his own life. And Yinsen's last words to Tony were, "Don't waste it. Don't waste your life." And then he died. This good man who Tony had dismissed years ago at a conference, this man who had saved Tony's life multiple times and who Tony had come to respect and care about, gave his life so that Tony could escape. And this sacrifice broke something fundamental in Tony's psyche, shattered the shell of selfishness and narcissism he'd built around himself. Because here was someone who barely knew him willing to die so he could live. And what had Tony ever done that was worth that sacrifice? What had he contributed to the world besides weapons that killed people and technology that destroyed things? Tony activated the suit's weapon systems and burned his way through the terrorists, using the flamethrowers to set fire to the stockpiles of Stark weapons they'd collected, destroying the missiles and guns and technology that bore his name. And he stumbled out of the cave into the desert and activated the suit's flight system, which launched him into the air in an uncontrolled trajectory that sent him flying across the sand before he crashed in a massive tumble of metal and fire. But he was alive, he was out, and he crawled away from the burning wreckage of the Mark I armor and was found by American military forces led by Rhodes, who had been searching for Tony for 3 months. And Tony was rescued and brought home to America, where there was a press conference scheduled at Stark Industries headquarters. And everyone expected Tony to say something about getting back to business as usual, about how Stark Industries would continue its mission of protecting America through superior firepower, but Tony didn't do that. Instead, he sat down on the floor because standing at a podium felt too distant and formal for what he needed to say, and he told the assembled reporters and Stain and everyone watching that he had seen American soldiers killed by Stark weapons, that he had seen the destruction and chaos his company's products created, that he had spent his entire adult life making weapons without thinking about where they ended up or who they hurt, and that he couldn't do it anymore. So effective immediately, he was shutting down Stark Industries' weapons manufacturing division. All of it, completely, until he could figure out a better way for the company to operate. And this announcement caused absolute chaos, sent Stark Industries' stock price plummeting, freaked out the board of directors and the investors and the government contractors who relied on Stark weapons, and most of all, it freaked out Obadiah Stane, who had been making a fortune selling weapons to anyone who would pay, and suddenly Tony was destroying that revenue stream. Tony holed up in his workshop in his Malibu mansion, this beautiful house built into a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and he started building, refining the armor design from the Mark I, creating something sleeker and more functional. And he had help in the form of Jarvis, an artificial intelligence system he had created years ago and named after his family's butler from when he was a child. And Jarvis helped Tony with calculations and simulations, and basically served as a very advanced assistant. And together they built the Mark II armor, which was silver and beautiful and could actually fly properly, with stabilizers and repulsors and refined controls. And Tony tested it at night, putting on the suit and taking off from his workshop, soaring up over Malibu, over the ocean, climbing higher and higher until he reached altitude where ice started forming on the suit and the systems froze, and he fell out of the sky, crashing back down through his house, destroying several of his classic cars and putting a crater in his workshop floor. But he was laughing because this was the most alive he had felt in years, maybe ever, actually creating something that could help people instead of hurt them, using his genius for construction instead of destruction. Tony refined the design further, creating the Mark III armor with the iconic red and gold color scheme. Red because it was his hot rod color scheme, and gold because it was his signature luxury color. And this suit was perfect, sleek and powerful and equipped with flight systems and repulsor weapons, and everything he needed to actually be a hero. Though he hadn't quite thought of himself in those terms yet, he just knew that he had power and ability, and after seeing what happened with his weapons, after Yinsen's sacrifice, he had a responsibility to use that power for something good. Tony's first real mission as Iron Man, though he hadn't started calling himself that yet, happened when he learned from news reports that his hometown of Gulmira, Yinsen's village, was being attacked by terrorists, the same 10 Rings group that had held him prisoner, and they were using Stark weapons to massacre civilians. And Tony couldn't just sit there watching this happen, so he suited up in the Mark III and flew to Afghanistan, halfway across the world, and he arrived in Gulmira like an avenging angel, landing in the middle of the village as the terrorists were rounding up civilians for execution. And Tony fought them, using his repulsors and his superior technology to destroy the terrorists and their weapons, saving the villagers, including a man and a young boy who would have been killed if Tony had been seconds later. And this was the moment when Tony Stark truly became Iron Man, when he used his technology not for profit or ego, but to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to make a difference in a direct and immediate way. And it felt right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. Felt like this was what he was supposed to be doing with his gifts and his resources. On the way home from Gulmira, Tony was engaged by two U.S. Air Force F-22 fighters who had been scrambled to investigate this unidentified aircraft. And Tony didn't want to fire on American pilots, so he tried to evade them while calling Rhodey to get them to stand down. And one of the jets got damaged during the chase and the pilot had to eject. But his parachute malfunctioned and Tony had to save him, catching him midair and deploying his chute manually before flying away. And this encounter made it clear that Tony's activities as Iron Man were going to attract attention from the military and the government, that he couldn't just fly around in a supersuit without people asking questions. The bigger problem was Obadiah Stane, who Tony still thought of as a mentor and friend, not realizing that Stane had been working against him for years, making deals with terrorists and criminals, selling Stark weapons on the black market to maximize profits. And it had actually been Stane who hired the 10 Rings to kill Tony in Afghanistan, because Tony was becoming unreliable and unpredictable, and Stane thought the company would be better off with Tony out of the picture so Stane could take full control. But the plan had backfired spectacularly when Tony survived and came back as Iron Man, so Stane needed a new approach, and he sent agents to the Ten Rings camp to recover the remains of the Mark I armor from the desert, and he hired scientists and engineers to reverse-engineer Tony's arc reactor technology and build Stane his own suit of armor, the Ironmonger, which was bigger and bulkier than Tony's suit but incredibly powerful, a walking tank that could match Iron Man in a fight. Stane made his move when he visited Tony at his mansion, and they were talking about the company and the future. And Tony was being open and honest about his plans and his concerns, and Stane activated a sonic weapon that paralyzed Tony. And then Stane reached into Tony's chest and ripped out the arc reactor, stealing it to power his own suit, leaving Tony to die on his couch, unable to move. And Stane told Tony that he had tried to have him killed, that he'd been working with the Ten Rings, that he'd built an empire on Tony's designs and Tony's name, and now he was going to take it all? And he left Tony dying on the floor while he went to put on the Ironmonger suit. Tony managed to crawl to his workshop, barely conscious, dying because without the arc reactor, the shrapnel in his chest was moving toward his heart, and he made it to a shelf where Pepper had mounted his original arc reactor, the one he'd built in the cave, in a little display case with a plaque that read, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart," which was Pepper's way of telling Tony that despite his flaws and his ego, she knew there was good in him. And Tony installed the old arc reactor in his chest, and it gave him enough power to survive. And he put on the Mark III armor and flew to Stark Industries headquarters, where Stane was rampaging in the Ironmonger, threatening Pepper and anyone else who got in his way. And Tony fought Stane in the streets and in the sky above the city. This brutal battle between the suit Tony had designed for heroism and the suit Stane had designed for destruction, between new technology and old, between someone trying to save people and someone trying to control them. And Tony was losing because the Ironmonger was bigger and stronger, and Tony's arc reactor wasn't at full power, but Pepper was inside the building and she had access to the massive arc reactor that powered the Stark Industries complex. And Tony told her to overload it, to blow the reactor, and when she did, Tony directed all that energy at Stane, created a massive power surge that fried the Ironmonger's systems. And Stane fell into the reactor core and was killed in the explosion. And Tony collapsed on the roof, exhausted and injured but alive. And he'd stopped Stane, but he'd also lost his father's business partner, lost someone he'd trusted, learned that the man who'd helped raise him after Howard died had actually been trying to kill him for profit. The next day, there was a press conference. And Agent Phil Coulson from the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, which Tony immediately started calling S.H.I.E.L.D. because the full name was ridiculous, gave Tony a cover story to read. A statement claiming that Iron Man was a bodyguard, not Tony himself, that Tony had been nowhere near the fight between Iron Man and the Ironmonger, and this would preserve Tony's secret identity and keep him out of the spotlight. But when Tony got up in front of all those reporters and cameras, when he saw them waiting for his statement, he couldn't do it. Couldn't lie. Couldn't hide behind a mask anymore. Because he'd spent 3 months in a cave learning that life was about more than just himself, that actions had consequences, that with power came responsibility, and he'd just spent weeks being a hero in secret, and it had felt wrong, felt like he was still hiding, still not fully owning who he'd become. So Tony went off script. He looked directly at the cameras and said 3 words that would change the Marvel Cinematic Universe forever. He said, "I am Iron Man," announcing his identity to the world. And this was absolutely not what you were supposed to do as a superhero. You were supposed to maintain a secret identity to protect yourself and your loved ones. But this was Tony Stark, and he didn't follow anyone's rules. And this decision to publicly own his identity as Iron Man would have massive consequences for the rest of his life and for everyone connected to him. That night, Tony went home to his destroyed mansion, walking through the wreckage to his living room, and he found a man standing in the shadows. And the man stepped forward, and Tony saw he was wearing an eye patch and a long coat. And he introduced himself as Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he told Tony that he'd become part of a bigger universe. That Tony didn't know it yet, but there were other people out there with abilities, other threats emerging, and S.H.I.E.L.D. was putting together a team. An initiative to bring together a group of remarkable people to fight the battles that no single hero could win. And Tony asked what it was called, and Fury said they were calling it the Avengers Initiative. And Tony's eyes lit up because this sounded exactly like the kind of thing he'd want to be part of. But then Fury told him that while Iron Man was definitely Avengers material, Tony Stark himself was not. That Tony was too unpredictable, too difficult, too much of a wild card, and S.H.I.E.L.D. only wanted him as a consultant, someone to advise but not to be a full member of the team, and this was probably the worst thing Fury could have said to Tony's ego. But it was also exactly what Fury intended, planting that seed that Tony needed to be better, needed to grow beyond just being the guy in the suit, needed to prove that he could be a team player and not just a solo act. The months that followed Tony's revelation as Iron Man were chaotic and exciting and overwhelming, because Tony was now the world's first publicly known superhero, and everyone had opinions about what that meant. The government wanted to regulate him or take his technology. Military contractors wanted to partner with him or compete against him. The media wanted to interview him constantly, and Tony was loving the attention and the fame but also struggling with the responsibility. Because being Iron Man wasn't just about flying around and looking cool, it was about making decisions that affected people's lives, about choosing which threats to respond to and which to ignore, about dealing with the consequences when his actions caused collateral damage or failed to save everyone. The government became particularly problematic, with Senator Stern leading a committee that wanted to force Tony to hand over the Iron Man technology, arguing that it was too dangerous for one person to have that much power, especially someone as unstable and egotistical as Tony Stark. And they brought in Justin Hammer, a rival weapons manufacturer who was basically everything Tony used to be, sleazy and amoral and only interested in profit, and Hammer testified that he was developing his own armored suits that would be better than Tony's, which was obviously a lie, but the committee wanted to believe it because they wanted alternatives to Tony, and Tony showed up to the hearing and hacked their screens and showed footage of Hammer's suits failing spectacularly, and he gave a cocky speech about how he had successfully privatized world peace, and the government should be thanking him, not trying to control him, and he got the committee to back off through a combination of charm and blackmail and demonstrating that nobody else was even close to replicating his technology. But Tony had a bigger problem that he wasn't telling anyone about. The palladium core in his arc reactor that was keeping him alive was also slowly poisoning him. The palladium was toxic, and it was leaching into his blood, and there was no other element known to science that could replace it without losing the power necessary to run the electromagnet, keeping the shrapnel from his heart, and Tony was dying, his blood toxicity levels rising every day, and he didn't know how to fix it, didn't have a solution, and this was maybe the first time in Tony's life that his genius couldn't solve a problem, and he started doing increasingly reckless things, making Pepper the CEO of Stark Industries because he knew he wouldn't be around much longer, promoting his driver, Happy Hogan, to head of security, getting drunk in the Iron Man suit at his birthday party and letting people take shots at him with repulsors while he was wasted. And this behavior alienated everyone around him, especially Rhodey, who finally had enough and took one of Tony's older suits, the Mark II, and delivered it to the military where it was weaponized by Justin Hammer and turned into War Machine. And Tony was pushing everyone away because he thought he was going to die and he didn't want them to watch it happen, didn't want to admit he was scared and didn't have all the answers. Nick Fury put Tony under house arrest and sent in Natasha Romanoff, who'd been working undercover as Tony's new assistant, Natalie Rushman. And Tony learned that she was actually a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, a super spy called Black Widow, and she gave him an injection that slowed the palladium poisoning temporarily. And Fury gave Tony a box of his father's old research, films and notebooks from Howard Stark's work with S.H.I.E.L.D. in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. And Fury told Tony that maybe his father had left him a solution, that Howard had been working on something big before he died. And Tony spent days going through the materials, watching old film reels of his father giving presentations at Stark Expo, and hidden in one of those reels was a message. His father looking directly at the camera and talking about how his greatest creation wasn't a weapon or a piece of technology. It was his son, and that Tony would go on to accomplish things Howard could only dream of. And in the film of the 1974 Stark Expo, there was a blueprint. The layout of the expo grounds contained a hidden pattern that was actually an atomic structure, a new element that Howard had theorized but couldn't create with the technology of his time. And this was Howard's message to Tony across the decades. A father telling his son that he loved him and believed in him and was giving him the key to solving an impossible problem. Tony built a particle accelerator in his workshop using parts from old machines and S.H.I.E.L.D. equipment, and he synthesized the new element, creating a new arc reactor core that was clean and non-toxic and even more powerful than the palladium version. And he cured himself of the palladium poisoning, saved his own life using his father's research, and this gave Tony a whole new perspective on Howard, realizing that his father had loved him and believed in him even if Howard had been terrible at expressing those feelings, that Howard's distant and critical behavior had been his own damage and limitations, not a reflection of Tony's worth. And Tony felt connected to his father for the first time, felt part of a legacy that was bigger than just himself. And this emotional breakthrough helped Tony grow up in ways that nothing else had, made him think about what he wanted to leave behind, what his own legacy would be beyond just being the guy in the iron suit. Of course, Tony didn't get much time to reflect on this because Ivan Vanko showed up, a Russian physicist whose father Anton had worked with Howard Stark decades ago on the arc reactor project and felt he'd been cheated out of credit and money when Howard kicked him out of the United States and took all the glory. And Ivan built his own arc reactor using his father's old notes. And he built weapons, electrified whips called the Whiplash. And he attacked Tony at a car race in Monaco, stepping onto the track and slicing race cars in half with his energy whips. And Tony barely escaped by having Happy and Pepper bring him the portable Iron Man suit that he'd started keeping in a briefcase. And Tony fought Vanko on the racetrack and defeated him. But the damage was done because Vanko had proven that arc reactor technology was no longer unique to Tony, that other people could build it and weaponize it, and Tony's monopoly on this power was over. Justin Hammer, seeing an opportunity to finally compete with Tony Stark, arranged for Vanko to be broken out of prison and hired him to build armored suits that Hammer could sell to the military. But Vanko had his own agenda. He didn't care about Hammer's business plans. He just wanted revenge on Tony for what Howard had done to Anton. Wanted to destroy the Stark legacy? So he built an army of drones and hacked into the War Machine suit that Rhodey was wearing. And at the Stark Expo, this big public event where Tony was supposed to showcase the future of technology, Vanko attacked, sending his drones and the hijacked War Machine to kill Tony in front of thousands of people. And Tony and Rhodey, working together once Rhodey broke free of Vanko's control, fought through waves of drones and then confronted Vanko in his own armored suit, the Whiplash Mark II, and they defeated him but barely, and the expo was heavily damaged. And Tony realized that every time he created something, every time he thought he was making the world safer, someone else would find a way to use that same technology to make the world more dangerous. And this burden, the knowledge that his genius came with costs, that his inventions could be corrupted and weaponized no matter how good his intentions were, was something Tony would carry for the rest of his life. This weight of responsibility for not just his own actions, but for what other people did with his ideas. Tony and Pepper finally got together romantically after the Stark Expo incident, acknowledging the feelings that had been building for years. And for a while, Tony's life settled into something approaching normal. He was Iron Man. He was dating the woman he loved. He was running Stark Industries with Pepper as CEO. He was working with S.H.I.E.L.D. as a consultant. And things were good. But then the Avengers Initiative was activated for real when Loki, the god of mischief and Thor's adopted brother, stole the Tesseract, an Infinity Stone of incredible power, and planned to use it to open a portal and bring an alien army to conquer Earth. And Nick Fury assembled the team, bringing together Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, who'd been frozen in ice since World War II and recently awakened, Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk, Thor, Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, and Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye. And these people were not a team. They were a collection of massive egos and conflicting personalities and deep personal trauma. And they fought with each other as much as they fought Loki, with Tony and Steve especially clashing because they represented different eras and different philosophies. Steve was about duty and sacrifice and following orders, while Tony was about individual freedom and questioning authority and doing things his own way. And Steve saw Tony as everything wrong with modern society, selfish and undisciplined and unwilling to sacrifice, while Tony saw Steve as a relic from his father's generation, self-righteous and judgmental and representing all the ways Tony had never measured up to Howard's expectations. The Avengers came together on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, this massive flying aircraft carrier, and Imi. Dietly started arguing, and Loki's plan was actually to turn them against each other, to use their egos and conflicts to tear the team apart from within. And it was working. They were at each other's throats. with Tony and Steve nearly coming to blows and Bruce feeling like everyone was treating him as a bomb waiting to go off rather than a person. And then Loki's agents attacked the helicarrier, causing explosions and releasing the Hulk. And in the chaos, Agent Phil Coulson, who had been a friend to Tony and who believed in the Avengers idea, was killed by Loki, and his death was the wake-up call the team needed, the tragedy that made them realize they were fighting the wrong enemy, that they needed to stop fighting each other and start fighting Loki, and they came together properly for the first time, not as individuals but as a team. And when Loki opened a portal above New York City and the Chitauri alien army poured through to invade Earth, the Avengers assembled in the streets of Manhattan to fight. And this was it. This was the moment that defined the MCU. These 6 heroes working together, covering each other's weaknesses and amplifying each other's strengths, fighting an impossible battle against an alien invasion. Tony was in the air in his Iron Man suit, fighting Chitauri flyers and directing civilians to safety. And for the first time in his life, he was following someone else's orders, listening to Steve Rogers, who was coordinating the team from the ground. And Tony was learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself, to trust other people, to have his back, to work toward a common goal instead of just showing off. And when he learned that the government had decided to nuke Manhattan to stop the invasion, had decided that acceptable losses included millions of civilians, Tony intercepted the missile and made a decision. He grabbed it and flew it up through the portal into space, knowing this was probably a one-way trip. Planning to redirect the nuke at the Chitauri command ship and cut off the invasion at its source, but also knowing he probably wouldn't make it back through the portal before it closed. And he called Pepper to say goodbye, and he flew into space and released the nuke and watched it destroy the command ship. And then his suit lost power in the vacuum of space and he fell back toward the portal unconscious, and he fell through just before it closed, falling toward the ground thousands of feet below, and the Hulk caught him and roared to wake him up. And Tony's first words after sacrificing himself to save millions of people were, "Please tell me nobody kissed me," because he covered his trauma and fear with humor. But he'd changed. He'd been part of a team. He'd sacrificed for others. He'd been a real hero for the first time. And it had cost him something, had taken something from him that he'd never get back. His belief that he could control everything. His sense of safety. His confidence that he could always find a solution. Because he'd been helpless in space, had genuinely thought he was going to die, and that terror would haunt him. The Sokovia Accords changed everything for Tony Stark and the Avengers, representing a fundamental philosophical divide that would tear apart the team he'd helped build and haunt him for years to come. Because after the disaster in Sokovia, where Ultron, Tony's creation born from fear and arrogance, nearly caused an extinction-level event and actually did kill thousands of innocent people, including a young man named Charlie Spencer, whose mother confronted Tony at MIT and showed him a picture of her dead son and told Tony that her boy's death was his fault. Tony couldn't argue with her, couldn't dismiss her pain or justify his actions, because she was right. He had built Ultron without consulting the team, had let his fear of another alien invasion cloud his judgment, had played God with artificial intelligence he didn't fully understand, and people died because of his choices. And this guilt, this crushing weight of responsibility for those deaths, made Tony believe that the Avengers needed oversight, needed someone to tell them no sometimes, needed accountability for the collateral damage they caused while saving the world. The Accords were a United Nations resolution that would place the Avengers under an international panel's control, requiring them to only act when authorized, to accept responsibility and potentially punishment for damages caused during their operations, essentially turning them from independent heroes into government employees. And Tony supported this despite knowing it wasn't perfect, despite understanding the risks of government control, because he'd seen what happened when the Avengers operated without any checks on their power, when people like him made decisions based on fear and ego rather than oversight and consensus. And he thought this was the price they needed to pay to continue operating, the compromise they needed to make to maintain the world's trust. Steve Rogers saw it completely differently, arguing that the Accords would be used to stop the Avengers from doing the right thing, that governments had agendas and the Avengers needed to be free to act when they saw something wrong. And Steve had good reason for this belief because S.H.I.E.L.D., the organization he'd trusted, had been infiltrated by Hydra and used to nearly kill millions of people. And he couldn't trust that the panel controlling the Avengers wouldn't be similarly compromised or corrupted. couldn't accept that someone else would decide where and when they could help people. And both Tony and Steve were arguing from positions of trauma and fear. Tony afraid of his own judgment after Ultron, Steve afraid of corrupt authority after Hydra, and neither could see that they were both right and both wrong, that the issue was more nuanced than either position allowed for. The debate became a crisis when a terrorist attack at the UN in Vienna killed King T'Chaka of Wakanda, and security footage showed that the bomber was Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, Steve's best friend from World War II who'd been brainwashed and turned into a Hydra assassin. And Steve believed Bucky was being framed and decided to protect him instead of turning him over to authorities, going rogue and recruiting allies including Sam Wilson, Wanda Maximoff, Clint Barton, and Scott Lang, while Tony assembled his own team of Vision, Natasha Romanoff, James Rhodes, T'Challa, the new Black Panther, and a new recruit, a kid from Queens named Peter Parker, who Tony had discovered through tracking videos of a guy in a homemade suit doing incredible things, stopping cars with his bare hands, sticking to walls, swinging on some kind of webbing. Tony went to Queens, walked into Peter Parker's apartment, met Aunt May, who was younger and more attractive than Tony expected, which flustered him in an amusing way, and talked to Peter alone in his room, revealing that he knew Peter was Spider-Man and asking for his help with this Avengers situation. And Peter, this 15-year-old kid who idolized Tony Stark and couldn't believe Iron Man was in his bedroom asking for his help, agreed immediately without fully understanding what he was getting into. And Tony gave him an upgraded suit with advanced technology and brought him to Germany for what Tony thought would be a simple arrest of Steve and his team, but which turned into one of the most devastating battles in Avengers history. Not because of the physical damage, but because of the emotional cost of friends fighting friends, of family tearing itself apart. The battle at the Leipzig airport was spectacular and tragic, with Tony's team trying to capture Steve's team and Steve's team trying to escape to Siberia, where Bucky said the real terrorist was hiding, and the fighting was intense. Spider-Man webbing up Captain America's shield and holding his own against Winter Soldier and Falcon while making nervous jokes because he was a kid and way over his head. Scott Lang growing to giant size and shocking everyone, including himself. Wanda and Vision, who had feelings for each other, forced to fight on opposite sides. And the battle ended with Rhodey falling from the sky after being accidentally shot by Vision, who'd been aiming at Sam Wilson. And Rhodey crashed into the ground from thousands of feet up and survived only because Tony caught him at the last second. But the impact still shattered Rhodey's spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. And Tony held his best friend, knowing that this injury was a direct result of the choice to fight. The choice to let this conflict turn violent, and Steve and Bucky escaped while most of Steve's team was captured and imprisoned in the Raft, an underwater prison for enhanced individuals. Tony thought it was over, thought he'd won, even though Rhodey was paralyzed and the Avengers were broken. But then he received evidence from Natasha, who'd switched sides and helped Steve escape, that Bucky had indeed been framed, that the real terrorist was Helmut Zemo, a Sokovian Special Forces operative whose family had died when Sokovia was destroyed during the Ultron attack. And Zemo's entire plan had been to tear the Avengers apart from the inside by making them fight each other, getting revenge for his family by destroying the team he blamed for their deaths. And Tony realized Steve had been right about Bucky and flew to Siberia to help Steve and make amends, arriving at the Hydra base where Zemo had lured them to find Steve and Bucky standing in front of a screen. And Zemo played footage from the 16th of December 1991, showing the Winter Soldier running Howard and Maria Stark's car off the road, strangling Howard Stark, Tony's father, and staging it to look like an accident. And Tony watched his parents being murdered by Bucky Barnes, watched his father desperately calling for help, calling Tony's name, and Tony turned to Steve and asked if he knew, and Steve admitted he did. He'd known that Hydra ordered the hit and that Bucky carried it out, and he'd hidden this from Tony for years. And this betrayal, learning that his parents were murdered and that his friend knew about it and never told him, that Steve chose Bucky over Tony even though Bucky had killed Tony's family, shattered something fundamental in Tony's psyche. The fight that followed was brutal and personal, not a superhero battle, but a brawl fueled by grief and rage and betrayal. Tony attacking Bucky, trying to kill him for murdering his mother, Steve fighting back to protect Bucky, and Tony screaming at Steve that Bucky killed his mom and Steve, saying he knew, admitting it while blocking Tony's repulsor blast with the shield Howard Stark had made for him, And the symbolism of using Howard's creation to protect Howard's killer while fighting Howard's son was devastating. And the fight destroyed the Hydra base and Tony's armor and nearly killed all three of them, ending with Steve abandoning the shield and walking away with Bucky, leaving Tony beaten and alone in a Siberian bunker, betrayed by the person he'd started to see as a friend, maybe even the brother he'd never had. And Tony returned to the United States to find Rhodey in physical therapy, learning to walk again with leg braces Tony had designed, and the Avengers compound empty, except for Vision, and Tony was left to manage the fallout, supporting the heroes who'd signed the accords like Rhodey and Vision while secretly helping the ones who hadn't, by ignoring their activities and even providing support through back channels because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, Tony still believed in the team, still thought they'd need each other someday. Tony threw himself into mentoring Peter Parker, this brilliant kid from Queens who reminded Tony of himself at that age. Same genius-level intellect, same enthusiasm for science and building things, but with a humility and genuine goodness that Tony had never possessed. Peter wanted to be an Avenger, wanted to operate on that level, fighting major threats, but Tony kept him street level, kept telling him to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and not worry about the big stuff. Partly to protect Peter because he was just a kid and Tony had already put him in danger at the airport, but partly because Tony saw in Peter a chance to mentor someone the way he wished Howard had mentored him. A chance to guide this young hero to be better than Tony had been, to avoid Tony's mistakes and arrogance and self-destruction. When Peter discovered a group of criminals using weapons built from alien technology salvaged after the Battle of New York, weapons that were incredibly dangerous and being sold to street criminals, Peter wanted to investigate and stop them, but Tony told him to drop it. That this was too big for a 15-year-old in a onesie, as Tony dismissively called Peter's homemade suit. But Peter couldn't let it go because people were in danger, and Peter had learned from Uncle Ben that with great power comes great responsibility, and he investigated on his own, tracking the weapons dealers and nearly getting killed several times. And Tony was monitoring this through the suit he'd given Peter and was both proud of Peter's heroism and terrified that this kid was going to get himself killed, trying to prove himself. The situation escalated when Peter's investigation led to his school's academic decathlon team being trapped in a falling elevator in the Washington Monument after one of the alien weapons exploded, and Peter had to save them while keeping his identity secret. And Tony saw this happen through the suit's monitoring systems and was horrified that Peter's friends were in danger, that Peter himself nearly died, and he confronted Peter, told him he was taking the suit back because Peter wasn't ready, wasn't listening, was going to get himself or someone else killed. And Peter tried to explain that he just wanted to be like Tony, wanted to be an Avenger and help people. And Tony said the famous line, "If you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it," challenging Peter to prove that he was Spider-Man because of who he was as a person, not because of Tony's technology. And Tony took the suit back and told Peter to stay out of trouble. And Peter felt like he'd disappointed his mentor, lost Tony's trust and respect. Peter discovered that Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, the man leading the weapons operation, was actually the father of Liz, the girl Peter had a crush on and had asked to homecoming. And this created an impossible situation where stopping the Vulture meant destroying his crush's family. But Peter went after Toomes anyway because it was the right thing to do, wearing his old homemade suit because Tony had taken the advanced one, and he fought Toomes on and around a plane full of advanced technology. And the plane crashed and Toomes was trapped in wreckage about to explode, and Peter saved him, pulled him out and left him for the police, even though Toomes had threatened to kill Peter and everyone he loved. Because that's what heroes do. They save people even when those people are enemies. And this act of heroism and maturity impressed Tony enough that he invited Peter to the Avengers compound and offered him full Avengers membership, even had a new advanced suit ready, the Iron Spider. And this was everything Peter had thought he wanted. But he turned it down, realizing he wasn't ready, that he needed to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man first before becoming an Avenger. Needed to understand what kind of hero he wanted to be. And Tony respected this decision enormously, saw it as proof that Peter had matured, that he understood heroism wasn't about the glory or the recognition, but about the responsibility. And Tony gave Peter back his old suit and told him he'd done good, and Peter went home happy, only to have Aunt May discover his secret identity when she walked in on him in the Spider-Man suit, which was a whole other problem. Tony's life had found a rhythm. He was with Pepper Potts, officially now. They were talking about marriage. He was supporting the Avengers who remained, helping Rhodey with his recovery, mentoring Peter, trying to move forward from the pain of the Civil War and the loss of Steve's friendship. When Dr. Stephen Strange appeared through a magic portal in the park where Tony and Pepper were walking, and Strange warned Tony that Thanos was coming, that this mad titan was collecting the Infinity Stones to complete a gauntlet that would give him the power to reshape reality itself. And before Tony could fully process this information, before he could even begin to prepare, a massive Q-ship appeared in the sky over New York, and aliens attacked. Servants of Thanos called the Black Order, trying to take the Time Stone that Strange protected. And Tony suited up in his new armor, the Mark 50, a nanotech suit that could form and reform around him, the most advanced armor he'd ever created. And he fought alongside Strange and Wong and Bruce Banner, who'd returned to Earth to warn them about Thanos. And Peter Parker showed up in his Spider-Man suit because his spider sense detected the threat and he couldn't ignore people in danger. And Tony was annoyed that Peter was there, but also secretly proud, and they fought Ebony Maw and Cull Obsidian, two of Thanos' most powerful servants, in the streets of New York, protecting the Time Stone and evacuating civilians. And when Maw captured Strange and beamed him up to the Q-ship, Tony and Peter got pulled up too, and Tony tried to send Peter home, activated the emergency return protocol in Peter's suit, but Peter overrode it because he wasn't going to abandon Tony. And the Q-ship left Earth's atmosphere heading for Thanos' home planet Titan. And Tony realized they were going to space. We're leaving Earth behind, possibly forever. And he couldn't turn back because Strange was captured and had the Time Stone, and Tony couldn't let Thanos get it. On the Q-ship, Tony and Peter saved Strange by blowing a hole in the hull and sucking Ebony Maw out into space. And Tony sealed the hole and they crash-landed on Titan, this desolate planet that had once been beautiful before Thanos destroyed it. And there they met the Guardians of the Galaxy, this ragtag team of space heroes led by Peter Quill, who called himself Star-Lord. And the two groups immediately got into a fight because of a misunderstanding before realizing they were on the same side, both trying to stop Thanos. And they came up with a plan. They'd ambush Thanos when he arrived, use Strange's magic to restrain him, use Peter Parker's webs and Mantis's telepathic powers to keep him subdued, and remove the Infinity Gauntlet before he could use the stones. And it was a good plan, a plan that could work. And Tony was terrified because this was it. This was the threat he'd been preparing for since the Battle of New York 6 years ago. The reason he couldn't stop building suits and planning and worrying, the reason he'd created Ultron, even though that had gone disastrously wrong, because he'd seen this coming, had known that something out there in space was planning to destroy everything, and now it was here, and he might not be strong enough or smart enough or prepared enough to stop it. Thanos arrived on Titan already having 4 of the 6 Infinity Stones, having destroyed Xandar to get the Power Stone, tortured the Collector for the Reality Stone, and taken the Space Stone from the Asgardian refugees after killing half of them, including Heimdall and Loki. And he was impossibly powerful, able to manipulate reality and space and power itself, but the team's plan worked initially. They surprised him, restrained him with magic and webs and telepathic control, and were pulling the gauntlet off his hand. We're seconds away from success. When Quill learned that Thanos had killed Gamora, the woman Quill loved had thrown her off a cliff to get the Soul Stone, and Quill lost control, attacked Thanos in grief and rage, broke the restraints, and Thanos fought back, and the plan fell apart completely. The battle that followed was desperate and brutal, with Tony and Strange and the others throwing everything they had at Thanos. And Tony fought harder than he'd ever fought, using every weapon his nanotech suit could form, missiles and repulsors and energy blades. And at one point, he went one-on-one with Thanos, this mortal man in a metal suit fighting a Titan with 4 Infinity Stones. And Thanos stabbed Tony through the abdomen with a blade made from Tony's own nanotech, nearly killed him, and probably would have finished him off, except Strange intervened, offered the Time Stone in exchange for Tony's life, and Thanos took it and left, and Tony collapsed, bleeding, asking Strange why he did that, why he gave Thanos the stone when they'd agreed they'd let anyone die to protect it. And Strange said, "We're in the endgame now," and told Tony that of the 14,605 possible futures he'd seen using the Time Stone, there was only one where they defeated Thanos. Only one timeline where they won. And this was it. This was the path they needed to follow. And Tony didn't understand, but he knew they'd lost this battle. Thanos now had 5 stones and would soon have the 6th. and there was nothing they could do to stop him from snapping his fingers and erasing half of all life in the universe. On Earth, Thanos ripped the Mind Stone from Vision's head, killing him, completing the Infinity Gauntlet, and despite Thor arriving with his new weapon Stormbreaker and burying it in Thanos' chest, the Titan had enough strength left to snap his fingers, and across the universe, half of all living beings turned to dust and blew away. And on Titan, Tony watched as people around him started disappearing, Mantis and Drax and Quill and Strange, and finally Peter Parker, who felt it coming because of his spider sense and stumbled toward Tony saying, "Mr. Stark, I don't feel good." And Tony caught him and Peter kept apologizing. "I don't want to go. I don't want to go, sir. Please. I don't want to go." And he was crying and terrified because he was just a kid. Just a 16-year-old boy who wanted to help people, and now he was dying and he didn't understand why. And Tony held him and told him it was okay, even though it wasn't. And Peter said, "I'm sorry," one last time, and turned to dust in Tony's arms. And Tony knelt there in the wasteland of Titan covered in Peter's ashes. And this was Tony's worst nightmare made real. This kid he'd mentored. This kid who reminded him of himself but better. This kid he'd come to love like a son was dead, and Tony had failed to save him. Tony and Nebula, one of Thanos' adopted daughters who'd been fighting against him, were the only ones left on Titan, and they were stranded with no way home, no ship, no way to contact Earth, and Tony used what was left of his nanotech to repair Nebula's cybernetic parts, and together they worked on the damaged ship that the Guardians had arrived in, trying to get it functional enough to reach Earth even though it would take weeks, and they had limited oxygen and no food. And Tony recorded messages to Pepper on his helmet, goodbye messages, because he thought he was going to die out there in space. And he talked about how he wished they'd had more time, wished he'd married her when he had the chance, wished they'd had kids. And he was drifting in space, oxygen almost gone, slowly dying, when a bright light appeared outside the ship and Captain Marvel, this incredibly powerful new hero, found them and brought them back to Earth. And Tony stumbled off the ship at the Avengers compound, weak and emaciated and traumatized. And the first person he saw was Steve Rogers, and all the pain and betrayal from Siberia came flooding back. And Tony got in Steve's face, ripped out his arc reactor and shoved it at Steve, blamed him for not being there when they needed him, for the Avengers being broken up when Thanos attacked, for everything that went wrong, because Tony needed someone to blame, and Steve was there and they had so much unresolved trauma between them. And then Tony collapsed, his body shutting down from malnutrition and infection and sheer exhaustion. When Tony woke up, the surviving Avengers told him they'd located Thanos on a planet called the Garden, and they were going to get the stones and undo the snap, bring everyone back. And Tony wanted to believe this could work, but he was broken, physically and emotionally shattered, and he stayed behind while the others went to confront Thanos. And they found him retired and peaceful, living simply on a farm, and they learned he'd destroyed the Infinity Stones, used the stones to atomize the stones so his work couldn't be undone. And he'd nearly died from the energy required to do that. And Thor, consumed by rage and guilt because he'd had the chance to kill Thanos and gone for a dramatic moment instead of just killing him, decapitated Thanos, but it didn't bring anyone back, didn't fix anything, didn't even feel like justice, just felt empty. The world tried to move on, tried to function with half the population gone, and Tony couldn't do it, couldn't be Iron Man anymore, couldn't look at the suit without seeing Peter turning to dust, so he retired for real this time, married Pepper, and moved to a cabin on a lake in upstate New York, and he lived quietly for 5 years. And in that time, Pepper got pregnant and they had a daughter, Morgan, and Tony became a father, and being a dad became his whole world. Playing with Morgan, reading her stories, tucking her in at night, telling her he loved her 3,000. And for the first time in his life, Tony Stark was truly happy. Had something pure and good that wasn't complicated by ego or trauma or responsibility to the whole world. He had his daughter and his wife and his quiet life. And he tried not to think about the people who were gone. Tried not to think about Peter. Then Scott Lang showed up at the Avengers compound, having escaped from the quantum realm where he'd been trapped during the snap, and he had experienced what he thought was 5 hours but had actually been 5 years, and he realized that time worked differently in the quantum realm, and if they could control it, if they could navigate the quantum realm intentionally, they could travel through time, could go back to when the Infinity Stones existed in the past, collect them, bring them to the present, and use them to undo the snap. And Steve and Natasha came to Tony's cabin to ask for his help because if anyone could figure out time travel, it was Tony Stark. And Tony's first response was no, absolutely not. He had Morgan now, and he couldn't risk losing her, couldn't risk changing the timeline and erasing the life he'd built. And he sent them away, but he couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't resist the intellectual puzzle of it. And that night, after putting Morgan to bed, he went down to his workshop and started working on the equations, telling himself he was just checking whether it was possible, just satisfying his curiosity. And he worked through the night, and by morning he'd solved it, figured out how to navigate the quantum realm safely, invented time travel, basically. And he looked at a picture of him and Peter Parker, this photo of the two of them at the Stark internship. And he realized he had to try, had to give those people a second chance, even if it meant risking everything. Because Peter deserved another chance at life, deserved to finish high school and go to college and become the hero Tony knew he could be. Tony went back to the Avengers compound and agreed to help with the time heist. But he made them promise that they wouldn't try to change the past 5 years, wouldn't try to prevent the snap, because that would erase Morgan, and Tony wouldn't sacrifice his daughter even to save the universe. They could only bring back the people who were snapped without changing what happened after, and everyone agreed to these terms. And they assembled the team, Tony and Steve and Natasha and Bruce and Rhodey and Scott and Clint and Rocket and Nebula, and they planned missions to different points in time to steal the Infinity Stones before Thanos got them. And Tony was assigned to go back to the Battle of New York in 2012 with Steve, Scott, and Bruce to steal the Time Stone from the Ancient One and the Space Stone from Stark Tower. And Tony got to see his younger self, arrogant and cocky and having just flown a nuke through a wormhole, and he stole the Tesseract containing the Space Stone. But Hulk smashed into him and the Tesseract slid to Loki, who grabbed it and escaped, creating a divergent timeline, and the plan was falling apart. So Tony and Steve had to go even further back to a SHIELD base in 1970, where the Tesseract was being stored after being recovered from the ocean. And Tony went to that time period knowing his father, Howard Stark, worked there, and he couldn't resist seeking him out, talking to him. And he found Howard walking to his car, and they talked, and Howard revealed that his wife was pregnant, that he was going to be a father soon, and he was terrified that he wouldn't be good enough, that he wouldn't know how to balance his work and his family. And Tony, pretending to be a fellow SHIELD agent, told Howard that his dad wasn't perfect, but that he always did the best he could. And Howard said no amount of money or technology could prepare you for a child, that the greatest thing he ever created was going to be his son. And Tony realized that Howard had loved him, that all the distance and the criticism and the emotional unavailability had come from Howard not knowing how to express his feelings, not from lack of love. And Tony got closure, got to forgive his father and let go of decades of resentment and pain. And he stole the Tesseract and some Pym particles and met back up with Steve, and they returned to the present. The time heist worked. They collected all 6 Infinity Stones from different points in history, lost Natasha along the way because the Soul Stone required a sacrifice, and she gave her life so Clint could bring the stone back. And they built a new gauntlet to hold the stones using Tony's nanotech, and they debated who should snap their fingers to bring everyone back. And Tony wanted to do it, but Bruce insisted, said the stones gave off gamma radiation, and he was basically made of gamma radiation, so he could probably survive it. And Bruce put on the gauntlet and snapped his fingers, bringing back everyone who'd been dusted. And it worked. They could feel it working. But the stones burned Bruce's arm terribly, fused the gauntlet to his skin and nearly killed him. And before they could celebrate, before they could even process that they'd won, the Avengers compound exploded, because Nebula from 2014 had been pulled to the present along with the Nebula from the present. And 2014, Nebula was still loyal to Thanos, and she'd used Pym particles to bring 2014 Thanos and his entire army to 2023. And Thanos blew up the compound and prepared to get the Infinity Stones and snap away all life in the universe and rebuild it from scratch. And the surviving Avengers, Tony and Steve and Thor, faced Thanos' entire army, just 3 of them against thousands, and it looked hopeless. They were going to die, and then portals started opening, and every hero who'd been snapped came back through portals created by Doctor Strange and the Sorcerers, and it was everyone. Black Panther and Shuri and the Wakandan army, Spider-Man and the Guardians of the Galaxy, Wanda and Bucky and Sam and all the Avengers who'd been gone, and armies from across the universe. And Steve Rogers said the words that every fan had been waiting to hear. Avengers assemble. And the biggest battle in MCU history began. Tony fought in the chaos, protecting the Infinity Gauntlet that they couldn't let Thanos get, and he saw Peter Parker alive and fighting and swinging through the battlefield, and they reunited briefly, and Tony hugged Peter. This kid he'd thought was dead for 5 years. And you could see the relief and joy and love on Tony's face, and Peter was babbling nervously about everything that had happened, and Tony just held him. And then they had to keep fighting because Thanos' army was overwhelming them, and at one point, all the female heroes gathered to protect Peter and the Gauntlet. And it was an incredible moment of unity and power. But ultimately, Thanos got the Gauntlet anyway. He was too strong, too determined, and he prepared to snap his fingers and destroy everything. And Tony saw this happening and remembered Strange's words about one timeline where they won. And he understood what he had to do, understood why Strange had saved his life on Titan. Because this moment required Tony Stark specifically, required his genius and his nanotech and his willingness to sacrifice. And Tony lunged at Thanos, grabbing for the gauntlet. And Thanos pushed him away, told him, "I am inevitable," and snapped his fingers. But nothing happened. And Thanos looked at his gauntlet and the stones were gone. And Tony had used his nanotech to steal the stones from Thanos' gauntlet and integrate them into his own armor. And the stones arranged themselves on Tony's hand, and he looked at Thanos and said, "And I am Iron Man," echoing the words that had started his journey 11 years ago. The words that had announced to the world that Tony Stark was a hero, and he snapped his fingers. And the power of all 6 Infinity Stones surged through him, and Thanos and his entire army turned to dust and blew away, defeated forever. But the energy was too much for Tony's human body to handle. The gamma radiation was burning him from the inside out, and he collapsed, his armor smoking and melting, the right side of his body charred and dying. Rhodey reached him first, kneeling beside his best friend, and then Peter arrived, and Peter was crying, telling Tony, "We won, Mr. Stark. We won, you did it, sir." And trying to tell Tony that he could rest now, that it was okay, and Tony couldn't speak, could barely move, and then Pepper arrived and knelt beside him and took his hand. And she told him, "You can rest now." And Tony tried to speak, tried to tell her he loved her 3,000, wanted to tell her about Morgan and make sure Morgan knew he loved her, but he couldn't get the words out, and Pepper told him it was okay, that she and Morgan would be fine, and the arc reactor in Tony's chest flickered and went dark, and Tony Stark died there on the battlefield, surrounded by the people he'd fought beside and the kid he'd mentored and the woman he loved, and he died having saved the entire universe, having proven that the selfish billionaire from Malibu, who only cared about himself, could change, could grow, could become the greatest hero the world had ever known. Tony's funeral brought together everyone whose lives he'd touched, and it was held at his cabin on the lake, and there was Steve and Thor and Bruce and Clint and all the Avengers, and there was Fury and Maria Hill, and there was Happy and Rhodey, and there was the kid from Iron Man 3, Harley, all grown up now, and there was Carol Danvers and the Guardians of the Galaxy, and there was T'Challa and Shuri, and there was Stephen Strange and Wong, and there was Scott and Hope, and most importantly, there was Peter Parker, standing there in a black suit, don't crying because he'd lost another father figure, another mentor who'd believed in him, and there was Pepper holding Morgan, this little girl who'd never really get to know her father, who'd grow up with stories and videos but without his presence, and they sent a holographic message from Tony, a message he'd recorded just in case the time heist went wrong, and Tony appeared as a hologram in front of everyone and said his goodbyes, told Morgan that he loved her 3,000, told Pepper that his greatest honor was being her husband and Morgan's father, and the hologram faded and there was just an arc reactor, the first one Tony had built in a cave with a box of scraps, floating on the lake with a wreath, and the inscription read, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart." And that was it. That was how Tony Stark's story ended. Not in a Malibu mansion surrounded by excess, not in a cave in Afghanistan where it all began, but at a quiet cabin on a lake, mourned by heroes and friends and family, having given everything to save everyone. Tony's legacy lived on in so many ways. In the technology he created that continued to protect people, in the Stark Industries building that was being converted to Avengers headquarters, In the iron spider suit that Peter Parker kept and wore to continue being a hero. In Morgan, who would grow up to be brilliant like her father. In every hero he'd inspired or mentored or fought beside. And most of all, in the simple fact that half the universe existed because Tony Stark had chosen to sacrifice himself. Had chosen to be the hero even when it cost him everything. Had proven that anyone can change, that redemption is possible, that the measure of a person isn't where they start, but where they end up and what they're willing to give for others. The man who started in a cave in Afghanistan building a weapon to escape had ended on a battlefield using infinity stones to save everyone, and the journey between those two moments had been filled with mistakes and arrogance and failure and growth. But Tony had never stopped trying to be better, never stopped working to earn the title of hero, and in the end, he'd earned it in the most absolute way possible, by giving his life so that everyone else could live. And there was a beautiful symmetry to it, that the first words Tony spoke as Iron Man were "I am Iron Man," and the last words he spoke before dying were "I am Iron Man." And those three words contained his entire journey. His acceptance of responsibility, his ownership of his identity as a hero, his willingness to stand up and be counted when the universe needed someone to make the hard choice. And Tony Stark made that choice, snapped his fingers, saved everyone, and died a hero. The hero he'd been trying to become since the moment Yinsen died in that cave and told him not to waste his life. And Tony hadn't wasted it. He'd used every moment to become better, to help people, to build a legacy that would outlast him. And in the end, Tony Stark, genius billionaire playboy philanthropist, the man in the iron suit, saved the entire universe and proved that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow, willing to change, willing to sacrifice, willing to stand up when everyone else is falling down and say, "I am Iron Man," and mean it with every fiber of your being. And Tony meant it, lived it, died for it. And that's why Tony Stark will never be forgotten. Why Iron Man will always be the hero who started the MCU and saved the MCU, the genius in the armor who had the biggest heart of anyone. And if you're falling asleep to this story, dream of flying in iron armor over New York City. Dream of being part of something bigger than yourself. Dream of having the courage to change and grow and become the hero you're meant to be. Because that's what Tony Stark did, that's what Iron Man proved is possible. And rest now, sleep well, and remember that we can all be heroes in our own way. We all have the power to choose who we want to be, to sacrifice for others, to make the world a little bit better than we found it. Just like Tony Stark did, just like Iron Man proved, every single day from that cave in Afghanistan to that battlefield where he snapped his fingers and saved us all. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for letting me tell you the story of the greatest hero the MCU ever knew, Tony Stark, Iron Man. The man who proved that anyone can be a hero if they're willing to pay the price. And Tony paid it gladly, saved everyone, and earned his rest. So rest now yourself. Dream of heroes and sacrifice and redemption. And wake up tomorrow ready to be a little bit better, a little bit braver, a little bit more like the man in the iron armor who started with nothing and ended having given everything.